It's a month after I came back from my trip, father and son trip to France, and where we followed the trail of my father's division, the 44th Infantry Division. It was a fabulous experience for me. First, being with my father. Second, after so many years, getting a better understanding, feeling for the stories I've heard throughout my life.
My name is John Warner. I grew up in Michigan in the 20s, 1920s that is. In my high school years, I was very actively involved in sports and music. I was a fair student, and then I was able to go to college, and that opportunity didn't last very long because World War II came in.
John's longtime best friend, John Monosmith, had always wanted to fly, and he went to Canada and joined the Royal Canadian Air Force.
He became a pilot and did 60 missions as a fighter pilot for the RCAF, and then transferred to the American Air Force.
John Warner had wanted to follow his friend, but his eyes weren't good enough to fly.
I did go into the Army then in 1943 at the age of 20, and I got to go to the University of Minnesota Engineering School until they stopped all education and they sent us to a training camp in Kansas for 90 days to learn how to fight a war in the infantry. 3,000 of us got on the USS Monticello. There were men stacked up 8 high with their duffel bag in their bunk. We did know there was a landing, but we didn't have any detail about it. We arrived in Cherbourg in 1944. The luck that we had was not to arrive on D-Day. They had a big meeting with the general, and he announced to everybody that we wouldn't all come back, and that we'd be fighting for freedom and against Hitler. And we had a lot of indoctrination films, and we really believed in the cause that we were going to offer our lives for. I lost track of time. It was always raining, walking. We had tasks, terrible, difficult things, because the Germans were always firing mortars and shells and artillery and tanks and so forth. So I wanted to survive in that war and still do my duty as a soldier, and that is a hard combination. We moved up in different methods to keep up with the Germans retreating. And by the time we hit the Germans, it was beginning to be wintry, and we got to Paris, and from then on we pushed the Germans back all the way to the Maginot Line that the French had built.
In July of 2004, John Warner met his son Johnny in Paris. They rented a car and traveled to the sites that John had marched through in 1944.
The happiest part of our trip was finding each other. Beginning in Reims near the old World War I cemeteries, I wanted to show those to my son because I wanted him then to be prepared to see the cemetery where my division had been buried near Nancy and Epinal. American Cemetery honoring 2,200 war dead. Most died in the summer of 1918 in the Battle of Belleau Wood.
It's amazing. American flags hanging up there. Here we are, Sunday morning, second day of our trip.
We're going to the cemetery to see the grave of John Monosmith. And he was flying a C-47. He was supposed to meet me in this little village of France called Saarburg. And I was able to get a 24-hour leave from a nearby village where we were fighting and go to Saarburg, which we had liberated a week before. And I waited all day for John to meet me, and he never showed up. And I waited a month to find a V-mail letter from his other friend who was a pilot with him, stating that his plane had caught fire and he bailed out with a parachute that didn't open. Coincidentally, it was right near the cemetery that my division used for the burial of the fallen from my division.
How many people buried here?
5255.
5255.
best friend. Johnny, you're nice to come with me.
I wanted to come.
Hope you never have to send your son to anything like this.
In October of 1944, the 44th Infantry Division engaged the Germans near Luneville, France. The Germans were fighting a delaying action as they built up their defenses along the Maginot Line. Now John and Johnny Warner visit Emberbénil, just 10 miles east of Luneville.
All right, here we are. We finally found it. Tell us about where we are.
The Germans formed positions along that track, and that was our initiation of the hardest part of the war, moving into Emberbénil, where our worst battle of World War II for my division was. And inside of that forest, trenches from World War I and World War II, and the Germans have pillboxes in there. We had to push them through that forest. Our captain was shot in these woods, and many of our men. And nobody had time to pick up their dog tags or anything.
What's the relevance of the train tracks?
Well, that's where I hurt myself carrying the wire. I tripped on that tie, carrying a 100-pound reel of wire to the forward observer's post, which was up that way. I was looking on the website of the 44th Infantry Division, and I was able to find a description of the wiremen. Weapons and fire control relied mainly on the wire communications laid forward to observer posts and back to command posts. Wires were constantly being knocked out of service. That's when the wiremen came into battle. A wireman would be dispatched to keep communications going by repairing the damaged and cut wires with only his helmet as protection from the strafing machine guns and mortar and artillery. On many occasions, a wireman went on patrol into no man's land, dragging wire to maintain phone communications between the patrol and the company headquarters. The Belgian Bulge that you've heard so much about was the worst battle, and we lost, there were about 19,000 casualties in a month. We spent the winter coming back and forth. The Germans would push us back, and then we'd push them back.
Next, John took his son to Gross-Verdersching to visit the exact location of this photograph.
Experiences in each one of these towns were fabulous because we spoke with the people. My father was treated like a hero. The American and the Allied armies are well regarded by the French. They spoke well, they showed appreciation. That changed my image completely of the people of France. They are definitely appreciative of the Allies helping bring back freedom to their country.
By December, the 44th had fought their way to Biche, France. Nearby, at Simserhof, the 44th took 10 heavily defended Maginot forts back from the Germans.
44th Infantry Division came up here with soldiers and tanks and pushed the Germans back over the border.
Near the city of Biche, close to the border of Germany. Amazing. Unbelievable.
After winning the battle for Biche, the Americans found the French civilians hiding here in the Citadel. After 5 days of touring France, John and Johnny were back at the airport, heading back to their lives in America.
It was a great experience, and as I told my father, I'll take my son Billy there one day. It was a fabulous trip, something that I'll never forget.
In 1945, the 44th didn't have the option of flying home.
Once we liberated the Maginot Line, we were able to follow Patton's army. When it came time to cross the Rhine, we all joined together and crossed near Worms. And the Germans really didn't want us to cross that line because that was their last line of defense. Our job was to go to Mannheim, and just as we got into town, they blasted us with mortars and howitzers and tanks. We were stopped there and had to fight our way and push them back into the highway to Stuttgart. And we moved all the way to Ulm and Munich, on riding on tanks and trucks and anything we could to follow the German 19th Army. And our Air Force was strafing them. On that same route were the Jewish concentration camps that we relieved all the way to Bavaria.
While in Bavaria, the 44th captured a cache of V-2 rockets and their inventor, Werner von Braun.
Eisenhower and Patch and the generals in our area didn't want the French to take the surrender. They wanted to do it. They were competing with each other. In the meantime, the German SS troopers were hiding in the castles of Austria. They didn't know that Hitler had died, and they were shooting at us. And we had to clean out those mountains all the way to the Fern Pass, where we crossed into Italy. And finally, the Germans did surrender. And we went to a little village to celebrate, we thought. And the colonel told us not to do any celebration. We were going to get up at 5 o'clock the next morning and start training for war against Japan. We got on the Queen Elizabeth I, thousands of troops, and the dining rooms and beautiful parlors were all made into bunks and 8 levels high where the troops slept. I think we stepped in New York around the 4th of July. And the Andrews sisters were up in a dirigible singing, and Marlene Dietrich was waiting on the wharf to receive us because we were the first troops to come back on the Queen Elizabeth. It was a pretty exciting moment in our life. We were given 30 days leave. While I was on my 30-day leave, I went to the Capitol building to see in Washington, D.C., and on that morning they announced that an atomic bomb had landed in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And I was relieved in one sense that I knew that we may not have to land in Yokohama. But I was very sad to hear about the lives of the people in those 2 cities that had to go because of that war. And wars are cruel and mean to everybody, all the people in those countries who have to suffer through them and give up their sons to fight in those wars. I hated to see civilians and children die. And what it really did was save my life. In a selfishness, I was able to go on and live and have a family and appreciate life even more. But we still had to go to report in Arkansas for training because it took that much longer to get the peace signed, which took 2 or 3 months of training. So I didn't get out of the Army till November of '45.
At age 80, John found out that the Army had been holding the medals that he had earned during World War II. The most valuable medal that John earned was the Bronze Star. It's awarded for meritorious service while under fire. John earned it by carrying a communications line to a colonel who was in an observation post directly in front of the German tanks in Mannheim. To John, the most important medal is the Combat Infantry Badge. This badge indicates that he was in combat on the front line. The theater ribbon has 3 battle stars on it, signifying the 3 battles that John was in northern France, on the Rhine, and in Germany. John received the Army of Occupation Medal, even though he only remained in Germany for a few weeks after the surrender. John also earned the Good Conduct Medal, the American Campaign Medal, and the World War II Medal, even though he says everyone got that. Here's the shoulder patch worn by members of the 44th Infantry Division. After the war, the 44th Infantry Division compiled this combat history book and sent it out to all those who had participated in the war. This is a fascinating book, full of facts and photos, for anyone interested in learning more about the battles for France and Germany during World War II. And here are some souvenirs that John brought back from Europe in 1945. A German gun cleaning kit, a .35 caliber Mauser pistol, and a German Wehrmacht Army helmet. John is proud of his service in the Army, yet humble. He knows it is largely a matter of luck that here are these medals instead of one of these monuments like so many of the men he knew. John, thank you for your service.
Saturday morning, arriving at the Paris Nord, looking for Daddy. Here we are, Paris Gare du Nord. To rent a car, took us about an hour. We didn't have the Hertz customer service. How do you feel after your trip and that we found each other?
Look, the happiest part of our trip is finding each other. And Nancy and Maria called, so they both know where we are. And I've got the book that Nancy gave me to fill out.
Okay.
Johnny's going to write in it every day. Miles of excitement. And we're going to head for Nancy, which is near Epinal. And that's the cemetery that we're going to visit where our division, it's all kinds of great architecture, and I want Johnny to see it. 5,000 unlucky guys, and I'm one of those who can come and see them.
Okay.
I hope everybody follows this trip. We'll be on our way.
Okay, roll them. Where are we?
This is World War I, famous battle, American Cemetery, honoring 2,200 war dead of the United States of America from World War I, resting here. Most died in the summer of 1918 in the Battle of Belleau Wood, above the cemetery and in the valley of the Marne. 1,000 Americans whose remains were never recovered or not identified are inscribed on the walls of the chapel. 42-acre cemetery memorial. Use of the land was granted in perpetuity by the people of France.
Wow.
There are 14 additional military cemeteries
In this area?
overseas. Remember Flanders Field and
It's amazing.
the one we're going to,
American flags hanging up there.
the 44th Division, is called Epinal.
Oh, are we going to it?
Yeah, that's where we're headed.
Oh yeah? Where are we now?
Chateau Thierry.
American
Belleau
Monument.
Woods. World War I, they called the World War because they didn't know there was going to be another one.
There was only one World War back then. There was no one or two. This amazing monument in France where all the battles were fought in World War I. Little villages. Little villages. Almost 100 years ago. Major war took place. Beautiful village area of France. Here we are, Sunday morning, second day of our trip.
Here's where we're going today.
Where are we going?
We're heading for Epinal. We're going to the cemetery. soldiers were buried from all the divisions that fought in this area. Be there in 1 hour. And then we'll go to Looneyville and Sarberg.
Okay, and here's the plaza. What's the name of the plaza?
Stanislaus.
Stanislaus.
He was a king, a Polish king who started
And there he is in the middle.
Arts Center.
And these buildings were built in the early 1700s.
Yeah.
Unbelievable. And Nancy found it for us.
Nancy is our star.
She
They put her
came
name
to...
on the town.
It's her town. And it's under renovations, reparations. We're in Espinal.
You got your other camera?
Yeah, I do.
Let me get that distance. Here, I don't want to have my cane in the picture. Come in the picture with me. You look better than I do.
So give the setup. Where are we?
Yeah, tell him.
He-
We're going to the cemetery to see the grave of John Smith, who Dominique found in his computer. So this is, he died on the 13th of March, the day that I was supposed to meet him in Sarberg.
Cutting flowers for John Smith's grave. How many people buried here?
5,000. 5255.
5255. American soldiers buried in Espinal.
Okay.
It was heavy rain yesterday. We saw
Yeah,
a spot, so
we were caught
it's one nice and the other one on.
We were caught in the rain driving to Nancy. 3 times it poured down on us.
Very hard.
Good shape. He plays a lot of golf. That's why.
Ah, you heard from him. Yes. Your finger. Ah. So you got children, grandchildren, grandchildren. No. With the only son or?
One son and two daughters.
And two daughters.
One is my son that come with me, just the two of us. Are they in any order, like state of death or
Apparently no.
huh?
Apparently no.
Nothing,
No.
just random.
Yeah. The only difference you got on the H-stone is the Star of David. It's 116 Star of David. And all the other ones. And 4 medals of honor. 4 medals of honor. You got 4.
Yeah.
They are different because there is gold stars.
There it is, John. My very best friend from my childhood.
Tell us about him.
John was my closest buddy from the ages of 8 to till he died in 1944.
What was he like?
He was the smartest guy I ever knew. He was an all-A student. He was a close friend, a loyal friend. He joined the Royal Canadian Air Force when he was 19 years old. He did 60 missions as a fighter pilot. Then he joined the American Air Force. Then he was a flight officer. And I was going to meet him in Saarburg on this day, and his plane crashed, or in the air. He bailed out of his parachute, and it didn't open.
What was his nickname?
Monk. His name was Monk. His nickname was Monk, as in Lana Smith.
How about a favorite story about him?
He and I were competing always, and we got into a teacher came and picked us both up and whacked our heads against each other when we were in the 6th grade.
What year was he born?
He was born in 1922.
Where?
In Woodland, Michigan. He was
What was Woodland like in 1922?
400 people. He was
What was Woodland like in 1922?
400 people in Woodland, and he and I were the only two redheaded people, boys, and we became very good friends. It's an honor. Here, I'll get you. Will you? Please.
Wait, you know how to do this?
Where do that?
This.
Press the button, it'll go beep.
Is it red when it's receiving? REC?
Yeah, recording.
Johnny, you're nice to come with me.
I wanted to come
It's pretty.
see John Monismith.
Hope you never have to send your son to anything like this. Look at these rows of crosses, 5,000 of them, forever. In World War II alone, we lost 400,000 young men.
Even the France.
All right, here we are. We finally found it. Tell us about where we are.
Well, we're right near Embermenil, which is where our worst battle of World War II for my division was. There's the forest over there. And inside of that forest, there's all the trenches from World War I and World War II. And the Germans have pillboxes in there. And we had to push them through that forest. Our captain was shot, killed in these woods, and many of our men. And they had a pile of bodies back up there along the rail. And nobody had time, it was cold, and nobody had time to pick up their dog tags or anything from those so many bodies, and they were German bodies. And as we crawled through those trenches, we crawled over dead Germans who were killed in that battle. I'll show you more.
Tell us about how Embermenil and the train. What's the relevance of the train tracks?
Well, that's where I hurt myself carrying the wire. I tripped on that tie carrying a 100-pound reel of wire to the forward observer's post, which was up that way. And through there are paths in there that if I could find them, I could show you the pillboxes.
What do you say we drive down this road?
Let's go.
And here's the Embermenil train station, which is now abandoned. Yeah.
People, when I was here,
Yeah, they're
all
hiding.
up there. They put everybody in there.
They're all hiding in the citadel.
Yeah, up there in that fortification.
What's the name of the fortification?
Citadel.
The Biche. Amazing. Unbelievable. The citadel where built in the 1600s. Used during the wars to hide the civilians. Beautifully unbelievable. Never seen anything like this. Unbelievable. Don't know the history of it yet. Near the city of Bisch, close to the border of Germany. Here's the town. Looks like there's another fortification or something right there. Both World War I and World War II took place around here. And here's the small town of Bisch, which, after coming from Nancy, seems very German as opposed to French architecture. The names of the places. Just beautiful. Unbelievable little village. Paradise. The beach continued, different angle. Little church, little village, like out of a storybook. Unbelievable. And here's the citadel.
The French were presented with an attack by the Germans in 1940 and defended themselves at their Maginot Line. So-called, they valiantly fought until their government surrendered, and then they let the Germans occupy France for the 4 years until we came. And all this area was a German occupied area for that whole 4 years.
What area are we in?
1940 to 44.
What area are we in right now?
This is the bitch area of Cimarron Farm, Cimarron Maginot Line installations, which the 44th Division liberated from the Germans. In 1944, this structure was a defense for France. Then it was occupied by the Germans, and the Germans kept their torpedoes here, and the 44th Infantry Division came up here with soldiers and tanks and pushed the Germans back over the border. This miles-long Maginot Line didn't serve a purpose after millions of dollars of expense, and 860 men in each one of these cavernous lines under the ground lived and never got to really fight.
Here we are in a building built by Napoleon Bonaparte, where he would, my understanding is house the soldiers.
ça, c'est à identify.
No, you can start with some. Souvenirs, program model.
Louvre de France. The Louvre de France. The Louvre de France.
Alrighty.
Johnny, is this the last film we're going to do?
This is the last
All right.
night
then
of our trip.
I'm glad we could do it. I'm going to go down a list of things. Those 4 days that we've had together. It means so much to me. And one, just being together is
That was an
Highlight.
A+ for me too. The telling of the past of a war that he fought in, and the deeds that he had done, and the exploits with his buddies, they were all heroes, every one. It's a month after I came back from my trip, father and son trip, to France, and where we followed the trail of my father's division, the 44th Infantry Division. It was a fabulous experience for me. First, being with my father. Second, after so many years, getting a better understanding, feeling for the stories I've heard throughout my life. When I was a child, I heard the tales of my father and exploits of his buddies. Played with all the souvenirs my father brought back. This time, with him, I was able to get a somewhat better understanding of what happened in World War II. Got to see the places, meet the people, see the battlefields, and hear firsthand from a veteran who fought there the things that happened. We went to places like Nancy, Epinal, Embremenil, Luneville, Grossrodersching, places I had heard of but never seen. It was my first trip to France. And at one point in the trip, we were in Embremenil on the train track, and my father went over to the track and he told me the story of when he hurt his knee. And I was looking on the website of the 44th Infantry Division, and I was able to find a description of the wireman, which reminded me of that story. And now it has a little bit of better, I can understand a little better what it's all about. And I'll read it. Weapons and fire control relied mainly on the wire communications laid forward to observer posts and back to command posts. The vulnerability of the telephone wire was adequately demonstrated. Wires were constantly being knocked out of service by enemy artillery and mortar fire, and enemy tapping and tampering. That's when the wiremen came into battle. A wireman would be dispatched from one location to another to keep communications going by repairing the damaged and cut wires on the fields of battle, with only his helmet as protection from the bursts of enemy fire from the strafing machine guns and mortar and artillery. On many occasions, a wireman went on patrol into no man's land, the land between the furthest most foxhole of the enemy and his own comrade's foxhole, dragging wire to maintain phone communications between the patrol and the company headquarters. So he told me the story how he hurt his knee when he was ducking from enemy fire, and I was able to read about it. So now when I read things like this, I can imagine this trip with my father to see the battlefields. experiences in each one of these towns were fabulous because we spoke with the people. My father was treated like a hero, well regarded. The American and the Allied armies are well regarded by the French. They spoke well, they showed appreciation. That changed my image completely of the people of France. They are definitely appreciative of the Allies helping bring back freedom to their country. It was a great experience, and as I told my father, I'll take my son Billy there one day to experience the same thing I experienced, and we'll look at this video, the pictures, and I'll try to explain to my son through my father's words what went on there, so there will be a memory, and we'll pass on the memory of the great things that my father and his buddies and his comrades did in this war. People like John Monosmith, who lost their life in the war, young men who did not have an opportunity to life, who gave their lives for everybody's freedom. It was a fabulous trip, something that I'll never forget, and I will pass it on to my son.
My name is John Warner. I grew up in Michigan in the 20s, 1920s that is, and during that period of history there was a depression and everybody learned to work hard, and my family were farmers and teachers, and I was fortunate that I could get a good education in small schools and worked as peddling papers and worked in farms and worked in all kinds of odd jobs to keep alive in those years. And then I was able to go to college, which was a real opportunity that opened up my whole world. And that opportunity didn't last very long because World War II came in. In my high school years, I was very actively involved in sports and music and studies. I was a fair student. I went out for baseball, football, and basketball, played in the band, and besides all the odd jobs that I had that kept me very busy. My best friend in the elementary school in Woodland, Michigan was a boy named John Monosmith, and he and I were closest friends through those years, my 3rd to 8th grade in that little town of Woodland. And John Monosmith was a man who dreamed of flying. He always wanted to fly a plane, and he did. When we were 18 years old, he enlisted in the Royal Canadian Air Force, and he got his wings, and I went to attend his ceremony in Ontario, Canada. He became a pilot and did 60 missions as a fighter pilot for the RCAF, and then transferred to the American Air Force at the end of his 60 missions. And he was flying a C-47. He was supposed to meet me in this little village of France called Saarburg. And I was able to get a 24-hour leave from a nearby village where we were fighting and go to Saarburg, which we had liberated a week before. And I waited all day for John to meet me, and he never showed up. And I waited a month to find a V-mail letter from his other friend who was a pilot with him, stating that his plane had crashed or had caught fire, and he bailed out with a parachute that didn't open. And just coincidentally, it was right near the cemetery that my division used for the burial of the fallen from my division. And I was able to locate his grave after 60 years of looking and wondering where it was. I found that grave of my good friend. When my best friend got his wings in the Canadian Air Force, I wanted to follow in his footsteps and tried to get into the Royal Canadian Air Force, but my eyes were not good enough and I didn't pass the eye test. So I ended up years later in the infantry, where they didn't mind too much how much I could see. I did go into the Army then in 1943 at the age of 20, and I went to training in Jefferson Barracks and basic training. They did a lot of tests, and I was lucky enough to pass them all, and they sent us the highest ones to universities. And I got to go to the University of Minnesota Engineering School. It was a great opportunity for me, and I can't tell you how lucky I thought I was until the month that I graduated. We were advised that all students in engineering and languages and lawyers were needed in, we think, Normandy, and they stopped all education and they sent us to a training camp in Kansas for 90 days to learn how to fight a war in the infantry. They put each educated person one in each platoon to separate us, and we got the training and all of the hardships of infantry training, and within a few months we were on our way to port of embarkation in Rhode Island. When we arrived in Providence, Rhode Island, we were given all kinds of medical tests to see if we were suited and strong enough to go to war, and they gave us a duffel bag that weighed about 100 pounds, and we had to carry that for miles and miles to get on these beat-up old ships, where 3,000 of us got on the USS Monticello, which was once an Italian liner of some kind, and we were able to have a half hour on deck every day. Then we'd go down in the middle of the hold where there were men stacked up 8 high with their duffel bag in their bunk. We were anxious to get to Normandy. We did know there was a landing, but we didn't have any detail about it. We were fortunate that we didn't have to be there on that day of D-Day, and I happened to have my birthday on that trip. The luck that we had was not to arrive on D-Day, and we arrived in Normandy after D-Day and relieved the 79th Division. We landed in Normandy in a city called Cherbourg, a port, south of the beaches, very tip of Normandy, nearest to England. We got off on these little boats that were rocking in the waves. People got seasick. Everybody thought, we can't wait to land. But little did we know that what landing meant, what we were coming into, a war. And they had a big meeting with the general, and he announced to everybody that we wouldn't all come back, and that we'd be fighting for freedom and against Hitler. And we had a lot of indoctrination films, and we really believed in the cause that we were going to offer our lives for. We moved up through Normandy, and by the time we hit the Germans, it was beginning to be wintry and raining all the time, and we moved up in different methods to keep up with the Germans retreating. And we got to Paris, and from then on we pushed the Germans back all the way to the Maginot Line that the French had built. After we arrived in Paris, we moved out, and the Germans were retreating out to the edge of town, and we were riding on top of tanks and different trucks and things, trying to follow them and wait for them to form some sort of a defense. And we moved up the west to Reims and to a train station there. They had put us on a 40 and 8 train from Paris to Epernay, where we got off and then moved into combat areas. The combat area was beginning in Reims near the old World War II, World War I cemeteries, Chateau Thierry, the Verdun, and all of those areas that all of our soldiers had died in that war. And I wanted to show those to my son on our trip, because I wanted him then to be prepared to see the cemetery where my division had been buried near Nancy and Epinal. So in the wartime, I lost track of time. It was always raining, walking. We had tasks, terrible, difficult things, because the Germans were always firing mortars and shells and artillery and tanks and so forth. So I wanted to survive in that war and still do my duty as a soldier. And that is a hard combination to meet. Most of the guys that were in my outfit were unlucky that they didn't hit the ground fast enough, or if the shrapnel would hit them while they were climbing a tree to put wires, communication in to the front line, which was part of our communication job. We lost those kind of men, unfortunate, and I was more fortunate in surviving by some blessed fate that was in store for me. So I'm very thankful that I could get through those villages. Moving on to Nancy, from Metz, we went south and headed towards Luneville. Luneville was a little central city of 23,000, maybe a lot less then, 400 or 500 years old, beautiful little city, full of rubble now in the wartime, partially destroyed by fire by the Germans and the American planes. And we moved into Luneville up to Ebermesnil, which was on a railroad track, and the Germans formed positions along that track. And that was our initiation of the hardest part of the war, moving into Ebermesnil and then from there over towards the Maginot Line, where we spent the winter coming back and forth. The Germans would push us back, and then we'd come push them back. And it was cold, and I had a pair of gloves. And on New Year's Eve, we drew lots to see who would go out and reach to the enemy, because they were to see where they were, and we had men about 600 yards apart. And my buddy drew the short straw. He and another friend went out, and he had only one glove. Well, I gave him my left glove, and he was captured that night. So I had to go through the whole rest of the war with a right-hand glove, and kept my other hand in my pocket whenever I could. The Belgian Bulge that you've heard so much about was the worst battle America has ever fought. And we lost, there were about 19,000 casualties in a month during the aggression of the Germans. They were trying to counterattack. They put together all their armies that they had left and came right through the line in the middle of the night with wearing U.S. uniforms, which they'd captured from a warehouse. And they spoke English, many of them, and we didn't know for sure if they were Americans or not. And they took the 28th Division by surprise and annihilated our 28th Division. My luck was to be on the flank, and we were able to survive that because we liberated the south end of the Maginot Line, where dozens of these installed forts that the French had built to stop the Germans. Once we liberated the Maginot Line, we were able to follow Patton's army. We had been in Patch's army on the south end, and when it came time to cross the Rhine, we all joined together and crossed near Worms, which is a town on the Rhine River. And they were building these pontoon bridges, and the Germans really didn't want us to cross that line because that was their last line of defense. And our job was to go to Mannheim, which was right across on the other side, a beautiful German city. And as we arrived, the Germans were intending to surrender and advised us that they were going to give up that city because it's a beautiful city and it wasn't all destroyed yet. And just as we got into town, they blasted us with mortars and howitzers and tanks, and we were stopped there and had to fight our way back and push them back into the highway to Stuttgart. And that's when the Germans were in retreat, and our Air Force was strafing them along the highways, and I've never seen anything so sad, because on that same route were the Jewish concentration camps that we relieved all the way to Bavaria. And then it wasn't our task to stay there and rebuild those situations, but our army assigned other troops to do that. And we moved all the way to Ulm and Munich, riding on tanks and trucks and anything we could to follow the German 19th Army. And they were moving to the mountains, never thinking of surrendering, nor did they ever suspect that Hitler would surrender. So the 19th German Army was hiding in the hills of Austria. They were spread out all over, and the French First Army was on our flank, and they wanted the 19th German Army to surrender to them. Of course, Eisenhower and Patch and the generals in our area didn't want the French to take the surrender. They wanted to do it. They were competing with each other, and they got into a terrible situation. And in the meantime, the German SS troopers were hiding in the castles of Austria, and not knowing, there were no cellular phones in those days. There was no communication. They didn't know that Hitler had surrendered or died in his pillbox, and they were shooting at us, and we had to clean out those mountains all the way from Alpenverein, Innsbruck, into Austria, south to Italy, to the Fern Pass, where we crossed into Italy. That's where Hannibal had crossed centuries ago. And finally the Germans did surrender. And we went to a little village that day to celebrate, we thought, and a colonel told us not to do any celebration. We were going to get up at 5 o'clock the next morning and start training for war against Japan. And here we were, after 200 and some days of combat, facing a training program with bayonets and marching and all kinds of weightlifting exercises to get ready for a different kind of war. Evidently, we were considered trained troops, and they wanted us for the next step in the World War II. The war ended in May of '45, the German war, and it took us about 2 weeks of training in Austria, and then we took a train from Austria to Le Havre, which is a coastal town in France, where they had all kinds of pup tents set up for millions, hundreds of thousands of troops moving back through England to the United States. And you waited for a channel boat to take us across to England, where we had never been because we landed directly in France. And we got 24 hours of leave to go to London, and 24 hours to go to Bournemouth, which is a coastal city, in July of 1944. And then we moved up on another train to Gourock, Scotland, in the Firth of Clyde, and we got on the Queen Elizabeth I. Thousands of troops. It was all rigged up for troop travel, and the dining rooms and beautiful parlors were all made into bunks and 8 levels high where the troops slept. And it took us about 8 days to get to New York after being gone almost a year. I think we stepped in New York in July around the 4th of July. And the Andrews sisters were up in a dirigible singing, and Marlene Dietrich was waiting on the wharf to receive us because we were the first troops to come back, and the Queen Elizabeth. It was a pretty exciting moment in our life. We were given 30 days leave. The war was still on in Japan, and we were moved to a camp in Arkansas. But my luck was that in Washington, I went to Washington, D.C. to visit my sister, and we were walking in front of the Capitol when all kinds of commotion was evident, and we found out that the atomic bomb had dropped on Nagasaki and Hiroshima. And I can't tell you the happiness that we had to celebrate that moment. But we still had to go to report in Arkansas for training because it took that much longer to get the peace signed, which took 2 or 3 months of training. So I didn't get out of the Army till November of '45. Once the war ended, I was anxious to get back to school and complete my education. And I had determined that I was going to do some international type assignments that I would be able to travel and see the world. I had seen enough to realize that I wasn't going to stay in my little village in Michigan forever. So I went back to Michigan State and I got my degree. And then I found out about Thunderbird Graduate School in Arizona, which prepares people for international business and trade and diplomacy. So when I graduated from that school, I headed for South America on a freighter, and I learned the language, Spanish language, and was able to get a job with Pepsi in 1950. And that year I met my wife in Mexico City. She was an American Airlines stewardess. We fell in love, and 5 years later we got married. It took that long in those days to find a way. She had a career, and so did I, in different areas. And we got married. We went to Hawaii, and we had our first child there, a daughter, Nancy. And then from there, I got promoted to New York City, and we lived there for a year and a half, went on to Venezuela, where our son was born, in Caracas, and then we got transferred to Peru. And then in Lima, 2 years later, they announced that I was going to be vice president for Asia and Far East, living in Sydney. And so we went to Sydney, Australia, had another daughter there named Maria, and she was born in 1963. And as soon as she was born, my wife was in the hospital. I announced to her that we were being transferred back to New York, which was not the best news she could have heard at that moment. But we did, and we went back to New York with 3 children. Then we went to San Francisco, and then we went back to Mexico City, where we had met 12 years before. And we spent 20 years there. I've always wanted to take my son to Europe to see the war zones. So we spent in 1944, where I spent the year. And he never had time, and nor I didn't have time. It was just a coincidence that we found an opportunity to do this, because he had to go to London on business. And we were able to coordinate that trip, and I would meet him in Paris and spend 5 days traveling through the battle areas. It's probably something special to everybody to be able to do with their son, and you have him know what war is about and understand the cost of freedom, so he can tell his children, and they can understand what the cost was as he sees this film about the cemeteries and the burials of these young boys that fell in the, gave their lives for us today. We can be thankful and appreciative of that effort. I wanted my children and grandchildren to know the cost of freedom. All right, my name is John Warner. I live in La Jolla. I'm going to be 80 tomorrow. I'm very fortunate to be able to celebrate in good health a birthday of this nature so near the 4th of July when everything is exciting. And I am active in many areas of consulting, and I do a lot of board contributory work. Like I'm on the hospital advisory board. I do help poor children's clinic in Tijuana that's just been built for poor children to have medical service. I'm helpful and active on the Diabetes Whittier Institute that helps diabetics, which is a project we do every year for them to fundraising. So I play golf, and I go to Mexico City occasionally because I had a career there for 24 years when I was president of a large American company called Sabritas, which is a subsidiary of PepsiCo Inc. And I built that company from an insignificant small business of 37 bicycles to its present 10,000 truck operation throughout the country, selling snack foods in every town, village, and hamlet. And this company is one of the most successful companies in this past half century in Mexico. Has about 20,000 employees and delivers products to 450,000 stores throughout the country every 2.5 days, fresh snack foods that have to be served that way. First of all, I grew up in a little village in Michigan. I peddled papers and did all the hard work that children did in those days, worked in a factory, finally got to go to college. I went to Michigan State College, and just in the second year of my studies, the war called me, and I enlisted in the U.S. Army. The U.S. Army sent me to a special school of engineering at University of Minnesota, where I graduated within a month of graduation when they decided that they needed men in Normandy. So they sent us, all the engineers and language students and lawyers, they sent us all to Army camps to train, and mostly in the infantry. And 3 months later, we were on a ship to Europe to help fight the battle against the Germans. And then I did that till I was 22 years old. I stayed in the Army 3 years. I was lucky to be able to survive in that atmosphere because most of my friends didn't, and I appreciate that. I prayed a lot, and I was strongly worshipped God and had a faith that I would come through, and it worked for me. And I appreciate life ever since. I've had a greater appreciation of life and what America gives us here, and the freedom that we have in this country has made it worth fighting for. After that, I went to the University of Michigan State. I graduated again in another area called International Relations and Social Sciences. I went on to Thunderbird in graduate school to get a degree, master's in international relations, and then I took a freighter to South America. And on that experience, I learned Spanish, and I got a job in left there and came back and looked for a job in the United States. But on the way back, I went to every country I could in South America, including Panama and Cuba, Ecuador, Peru, Chile, and Brazil. And then, after coming back here, I got the job with Pepsi in 1950, and I worked for them for 37 years. In Mexico, in South America, I then was regional manager for Venezuela. I was in Hawaii, in the Pacific area. I launched plants in Honolulu, the Pepsi plant in Iloilo in the Philippines. Then I went back to New York in a higher job in promotion manager for the world. Then I went to Venezuela as regional manager, then to Peru as marketing manager for South America. And then I went to Australia as vice president of all of the Far East and Australian, living in Sydney. During my visits to those and stays in those countries, my wife and I had a little girl in Honolulu. We have a son born in Caracas, and we have a daughter born in Sydney, Australia. After living in Sydney, I got promoted to international marketing manager in New York for vice president of marketing. I went on from there to vice president of Western U.S. and then to Mexico again, where I became president of this snack company after Pepsi merged with Frito-Lay. And that was, next 20 years I handled that, and then I handled the food business in Venezuela and other countries, but my main effort was in that snack business where we built plants throughout the nation. And I did lectured at Harvard, and I proposed different methods of training for people and how to get along in other countries and how to learn languages and how to deal with governments. Today is a very important holiday for Americans and people who like America, appreciate the freedom that we have in this country and what was given to us by our forefathers who fought for that, and those of us who have had to go to war and also defend our nation when we needed to. My experience was exceptional because I did survive in the infantry, and we fought into Europe and the Normandy Peninsula, and then through France, northern France, into Germany, across the Rhine in March of 44 and 45, and then we went into Germany, and we relieved some of the camps for the Jewish prisoners who were killed, and the few skeletons that were left us in shock to think that the world could be that cruel, and it gave us even more incentive to defeat Hitler in that period of history, which meant so much to our freedom today. My infantry division was able to survive that whole war. Here's a booklet, a catalog of our accomplishments in all that area, showing how our map of our trails throughout the European countries. We ended up in Austria and crossed into northern Italy, where the Hannibal crossed. And even when the war ended, we had the task of cleaning out the mountains of Austria of German SS troopers who were hiding in the castles and didn't believe the war ended because they didn't have cellular phones, they didn't have connections to find out if it was really true that Hitler had died or had given up and that the Germans were defeated. And they killed a lot of our men while we were doing that job. And the day we finished that, we were called out at 5 a.m. in the morning to notify us that we were being trained for Far East warfare. Our training began at 5 o'clock and with bayonets and practicing. After spending a year of ground war with the Germans, we were learning a type of war that was completely different. And that training went on for about a month, and then we were shipped straight to England, and through England on rail road up to Gourock, Scotland. We got on the Queen Elizabeth, which in those days was converted to a troop carrier, landed in New York, and given 30 days leave in which we were allowed to see our families, and then to go back to further training and onward to Japan, where we feared having to land on another war that we had no experience. While I was on my 30-day leave, I went to the Capitol building to see in Washington, D.C., and on that morning they announced that an atomic bomb had landed in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And I was relieved in one sense that I knew that we may not have to land in Yokohama. But I was very sad to hear about the lives of the people in those two cities that had to go because of that war. And wars are cruel and mean to everybody, all the people in those countries who have to suffer through them and give up their sons to fight in those wars. I hated to see civilians and children die. And what it really did was save my life. In a selfishness, I was able to go on and live and have a family and appreciate life even more. I was lucky in the sense that our division was awarded a Bronze Star for heroic action against the Germans. If you can see this, I know there were a lot of other medals, Congressional Medals of Honor and Silver Stars that were won by many people, but in our area of combat, we didn't even have time to stop and mention it. But we were so fortunate that the Germans finally capitulated for many reasons of effort of Eisenhower and all the people and the services of the different countries that participated, Canada, England, United States, and all our allies. And I'm thankful that I was hoping that that would be the last war. It hasn't turned out that way. At that stage we said the war to end all wars, but it didn't seem to happen. And we're now in another war. And this being the 4th of July makes you very conscious of what we have to defend and how worthwhile it is to have a country worth fighting for. Well, I wanted to tell you about my family life, because that's been the most important part of my history, is building a family of 13 people. I started out single until I was 32 years old. I met a beautiful wife named Betty, and we were married in Los Angeles and then went on to live in Honolulu, where we had our first child. And we experienced all the diversity of the Hawaiian Islands and all the different nationalities of people from the Philippines, Japan, China, and Caucasians from America, all bringing together their racial blending, and it's a very exciting place to live. We lived there 2.5 years. Our daughter Nancy was born there in 1955. And we were transferred to New York from there, and with this little child, we lived there 2 years, and then to Venezuela, where we had a little boy named Johnny, and he is now 43 years old, and he has a little girl, 1.5 years old, and is expecting a son in November. He lives in Miami and works for MoneyGram, which is a money transfer company for Latin America and all over the world. where Americans transfer funds to their home country, or where people in America who work wish to send their families money. Mexico receives about $9 billion a year from immigrants here, and it's the most important part of their balance of payments to their nation. My son married a girl from Montevideo, and their little girl was born in Miami, and their son will be born there in November. My oldest daughter, the one born in Hawaii, has two boys, 16 and 14, and she married a Mexican named Eduardo Trevino, and they live in Irvine, California, right near us. My youngest daughter, Maria, married a Chinese Singaporean, and they live in Singapore and have two little boys, 9.5 and 4.5. And they're visiting now for my 80th birthday. So all in all, I'll show you a picture of my family. There's 13 of us now, expecting one more, which would make it 14. But we only have one granddaughter, and all the rest are grandsons. And we have one person to carry on the name of our family, which is Warner, and that would be that little baby that's expected in November. We feel very fortunate to live in the most beautiful community that I've ever seen in the United States. And it's rated very high. It's not the wealthiest community in the United States, but I think it's the most beautiful. It has a good climate. It has a very good location. It has Pacific Ocean. It has the beaches. It has a very small population. It has wonderful schools. It's next to a university, the University of California, which is one of the best for advanced degrees. It has art galleries. It has all kinds of access to academic and symphony music and beautiful parks and so forth in San Diego, which are only 20 minutes away. It's easy to get to the airport. It's only 23 minutes to the airport. It's not far from Los Angeles, but we don't have to go through the difficulties that people in such a large city go through. As you all know, Los Angeles is many millions of people and very crowded. Traffic conditions are very difficult. And even though we complain about our traffic, it's nothing like traffic in Los Angeles. We go there occasionally. It's only 2.5 hours from here to the airport in LA. Our airport is 22 minutes away, so we have it a lot easier airport access. I played golf whenever I could in all these countries that we have lived. I've always been fortunate to belong to some beautiful club, and like the one in La Jolla, which is a spectacular golf course, and you make very good friends playing golf. It isn't like tennis where people get mad at each other and hit each other with the balls. The golfers do not aim at each other, and they have to be nice to each other because they're together for 4 hours. And when you play golf in competition, you have usually very courteous opponents. It's always a gentleman's game, and so far it hasn't deteriorated. I played in Mexican tournaments, in Scottish tournaments, I played in Australia, I played in Hawaii, I played in the Philippines, and everywhere you go that you meet other golfers, you make friends. I played in the World Seniors Golf Tournament, and one of my most outstanding events was a World Seniors competition where you play in flights, and people from all over the world are categorized according to their handicap. I was in a higher handicap flight, and there were 16 people, and you match as a ladder system, and you have to win each match to win the tournament. And each time I had a miracle shot of some kind to get to the very end of the tournament, in which I was tied on the 18th hole of the course in the Broadmoor in Colorado, which is in Colorado Springs, a beautiful course. And we got into the very last hole, and my ball, for some miracle, came out of the trap and went within 2 or 3 inches of the hole. And I was fortunate to win the cup in that category. I'm very thankful. I have the trophy. This is the cover of a Bible that was printed in 150 or more years ago. It was given to my great-grandparents when they were married in Michigan in the 1850s. And it's deteriorated now, and I tend to have it restored. But it's so beautiful for anything that old, and it's so meaningful to me and my family. But these people were migrants. There were children of migrants who came from Switzerland in the 1870s, landed in Pennsylvania, migrated across the nation to Ohio, and then in the 1850s migrated to Michigan, where I grew up. They had a land grant of 350 acres of land in this little town, and he was David Landis, my great-grandfather, was a farmer. He was a school teacher, and he became a farmer. They built a log cabin, and they had 6 children, and each one had a book.
Can you turn some of the pages, or is
All right,
is it
now
too
I'll
fragile?
show you the page of the births of the 6 children that were born to this couple, Hetty and David Landis, who was, as you can see, the dates of their birth were: David was born in 1846, Hetty, his wife, was born in 1849. Their 8 children were born from 1871 up to 1890. There are 6 children. None of those children are alive, but their children are still alive. The oldest being my cousin Gordon, who is a doctor, lives in Grand Rapids, Michigan. He's 92. He still plays tennis and is very strong for his age. His mother lived to be 104, and she read to old people in this home where she lived. My grandmother lived to be 94, and so did one of her sisters. So I'm hoping that that could happen to me if I take care of myself, and it's worth it to try. On the other side, it shows the marriages of each of the members of the family and their dates that they were married. And then there are pages that show each child that was born to them. And then it also shows when they were buried in the Woodland Cemetery.